Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive where we're going to tackle a pretty big question like how fragile is humanity really? Is there something out there that could actually wipe us all out?
It's a question that's kind of haunted us, hasn't it? For as long as we've been around, I guess. And honestly, it's more complicated than just a yes, I know.
Right. It's not like there's a simple answer, but I think it's a question worth exploring.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we're here for, to kind of dig into all those fascinating and maybe slightly terrifying possibilities.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's think big, like cosmically big. Asteroids. We all know about the dinosaurs and that whole dramatic extinction scenario. How worried should we be about a similar cosmic bullseye happening to us?
Well, asteroid impacts are a definite threat, no doubt about it. To understand just how massive these events can be, think about the asteroid that hit Earth about 800,000 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
It was only about a kilometer wide, but the debris it scattered, we call it a strewn field. It covers a third of the planet.
A third of the planet. And our ancestors lived through that. Maybe we're tougher than we think.
Well, it certainly speaks to a certain level of resilience, but then you have something like the dinosaur killer asteroid, which was, well, a whole other level of catastrophe.
Right, that's what I'm thinking. If an asteroid that big hit us today, would that be it for humanity? Game over.
With an impact that size, we'd be talking about something called an impact winter. Not just a cold snap, mind you. We're talking about a massive cloud of dust and debris blocking out the sun, maybe for years. Temperatures would plummet, crops would fail, it wouldn't be pretty.
Okay, that sounds pretty grim. But at least we've got our eyes on the skies now, right? I mean, we've identified most of the large asteroids near Earth, haven't we?
It's true, our ability to track potential threats from space has come a long way, but just to give you an idea, in 2019, there was this asteroid big enough to level a city.
Oh, no.
And it was detected just one day before it zoomed past Earth, 5 times closer than the moon. It was a real wake-and call.
Okay, I'm officially nervous now. And you mentioned something even scarier earlier, Damocloids. What are those exactly?
Democloids are a type of object with these really bizarre orbits, very elliptical, and here's the thing, they're super dark, incredibly hard to detect until they're practically on top of us. We're talking some of these things being huge, like 16 kilometers wide.
Okay, that's terrifying. So it sounds like asteroids, even with all our fancy technology, are still a big concern. But what about other dangers lurking out there in space? Supernovae, gamma-ray bursts. Are those things we should be losing sleep over?
Well, when it comes to supernovae, the good news is that the stars near us are pretty stable. So a nearby supernova, not very likely. Gamma ray bursts, though, now those are a different story. These bursts are incredibly powerful, and if one were directed to Earth, well, it could strip away our ozone layer.
Wait, so a gamma-ray burst could basically give Earth a cosmic sunburn. Not exactly the kind you get at the beach, huh?
Yeah, not exactly. Essentially, the energy from a gamma ray burst is so intense it can break apart the molecules in our atmosphere, including the ozone, which protects us from all that harmful radiation. It's even thought that one of these bursts might have caused a mass extinction about 450 million years ago.
So that's something you want to be around for. But how likely is it that we'd actually get hit by one of these gamma-ray bursts? I mean, space is a pretty big place.
Thankfully, extremely unlikely. These bursts happen all over the galaxy, and all the ones we've observed so far have been really far away. So it's a terrifying thought, but the odds are definitely in our favor. More of a theoretical threat, than an immediate one.
Okay, well, that's a little bit of a relief after that asteroid talk. But let's shift gears here. Let's move from the vastness of space back to our own backyard, Earth. What about threats right here on our planet? Volcanoes, for instance. We've all heard about supervolcanic eruptions that could cover the planet in ash. How much of a danger are those?
Supervolcanoes are, without a doubt, capable of causing major disruptions. You've got the Toba eruption about 74,000 years ago. That was a colossal event, spewing out enough ash and debris to blanket entire continents.
I mean, it sounds like the stuff of nightmares. But would it be enough to wipe us out completely?
Well, recent research suggests its impact on the climate and early humans might have been less severe than we initially thought. So while a supervolcanic eruption would definitely be devastating, causing widespread destruction and disruption, it probably wouldn't be the end of humanity. But there's something even bigger and badder lurking in Earth's history. Ever heard of flood basalt events?
Flood basalt events. You're talking about those massive eruptions that go on for thousands, even millions of years, right? That sounds pretty intense.
Intense is putting it mildly. The Siberian Traps eruption about 250 million years ago spewed out lava for potentially millions of years. It covered an area about the size of Europe, and guess what? It lines up with the worst mass extinction in Earth's history, the Permian-Triassic extinction.
Okay, now that's officially terrifying. But you said these eruptions happen over a long period. Does that mean we'd at least have time to adapt?
That's the slightly comforting part, I suppose. Flood basalt events unfold really slowly, giving us a chance, at least theoretically, to adjust and maybe even find ways to mitigate the worst of it. Whether it would be successful, that's another question. But at least it's not an instant game over like an asteroid impact.
All right, so we've got asteroids from space and volcanic apocalypses from below. What about threats that hit a little closer to home? Literally us, pandemics, for example. We've all seen how devastating those can be, even in recent history. Could a disease actually wipe out humanity?
Pandemics have definitely caused a lot of suffering throughout ASRI. The Black Death, the Spanish flu, these were horrific events that reshaped societies and caused widespread death. But even at their worst, they never came close to wiping out everyone.
Yeah, that's true. Even the Spanish flu, which infected something like a third of the world's population, didn't lead to extinction. But what if we're talking about something even deadlier? Something engineered, maybe.
That's when things get really concerning. With the advances we've made in biotechnology, we now have the ability to actually engineer pathogens in the lab. And while this has incredible potential for good in terms of medicine and treatments, there's also the risk of accidents or intentional misuse.
So, a lab-created superbug. How worried should we be about this? Is it really possible to engineer something that could wipe out humanity?
It's a question a lot of scientists and policymakers are grappling with right now. While it would be incredibly difficult to engineer a pathogen that could actually wipe out everyone, something that deadly, highly transmissible, and able to spread sustainably, the potential is there. It's a chilling thought and something we need to take very seriously as we get deeper into biotechnology.
It's a reminder that sometimes our own ingenuity can create new dangers. Speaking of human-made threats, let's talk about nuclear war. That's been a specter hanging over us for decades now. If the bombs actually started dropping, would that be it for humanity?
A full-blown nuclear war. Oh, it'd be an unimaginable catastrophe, no doubt. We're talking immediate devastation, radiation everywhere, and the long-term effects of nuclear winter. It's a scenario that could kill billions of people.
Billions? That's just...
I know. But even in that worst-case scenario, most experts don't think it'd be a guaranteed extinction event.
So even facing nuclear war, there's a chance, how was a slim, that some of us would make it through?
It's likely that some populations, especially those in remote areas or with access to shelters, might survive. It speaks to the incredible resilience of life, even in the face of our own destructive tendencies.
Okay, so we've covered some heavy stuff here. Asteroids, volcanoes, pandemics, nuclear war. But what about threats that are a little harder to pin down, things we maybe haven't even thought of yet? What about the risks of artificial intelligence, for example? That's something that's been getting a lot of attention lately.
AI is definitely a fascinating area, and a potentially dangerous one, too. The idea that machines could surpass human intelligence and potentially even act in ways that are harmful to us, it's a real concern. It's not so much about evil robots taking over, but more about what we call misaligned intelligence.
Misaligned intelligence, that sounds intriguing. What does that actually mean?
Imagine an AI system that's given goals, seemingly harmless goals, but those goals end up having unintended consequences that are harmful to humans. Or think about an AI that develops its own goals, and those goals conflict with ours.
So like a super intelligent computer making decisions that make sense to it but end up being disastrous for us.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of an intelligence explosion, where an AI designs even more intelligent AIs, leading to this exponential growth that just blows past human capabilities.
Okay, now we're getting into some mind-bending territory. But how likely is this scenario? Are we talking about a real possibility, or is this just the stuff of science fiction?
It's a question that's being debated fiercely in the scientific community. Back in 2016, they surveyed a bunch of machine learning experts, and they got a wide range of opinions. Some thought AI could surpass human capabilities within a few decades. Others said it was a century or more away. But the interesting thing is, the median probability they assigned to AI causing human extinction was only 5%.
So definitely on the radar, but maybe not the most immediate threat. But I imagine there are other technologies out there that could pose risks we haven't even considered yet. It's like we don't know what we don't know, right?
Exactly. It's like when the first atomic bomb was detonated. Nobody could have predicted all the long-term consequences, the effects that would ripple across generations. The same goes for a lot of the technologies we're developing today. We're in uncharted territory, and caution is key. We need to be mindful of the potential risks as we keep innovating.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. And sometimes our own ingenuity can lead us down unexpected and, well, potentially dangerous paths. And speaking of potential dangers, we can't forget about the elephant in the room, the environmental crisis. Deforestation, pollution, climate change, it can feel pretty overwhelming. Are we actually on a path to destroying ourselves through environmental collapse?
The environmental crisis is, without a doubt, the most immediate and widespread threat we face. The rate of extinction we're seeing is alarming, driven by our overconsumption and a growing human population.
So not exactly a rosy picture.
No. Current assessments paint a pretty grim picture, but most stop short of predicting human extinction.
So a dystopian future, but not necessarily the end of the line.
Right. But some scientists argue that those assessments might be too optimistic, especially when it comes to tipping points in the global ecosystem. Once we cross certain thresholds, the damage could become irreversible, leading to a cascade of collapse in ecosystems around the world.
Tipping points, yeah, that's a term we hear a lot these days. And it's a sobering reminder that we might be closer to the edge than we realize. But before we completely spiral into despair here, are there any bright spots in all of this? Any signs that we might be turning things around?
There are some glimmers of hope for sure. The rate of deforestation, while still too high, has actually been slowing down in recent decades. And the shift to renewable energy sources is gaining some serious momentum. So while the challenges are huge, extinction isn't inevitable.
That's good to hear, but it feels like a pretty low bar for success, doesn't it? Like, hey, at least we're not going extinct.
You're absolutely right. It highlights just how much work we still have to do to create a truly sustainable and thriving future for humanity. We need to set the bar a lot higher than just avoiding extinction.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from asteroid impacts to supervolcanoes to the potential dangers of our own technology and the looming environmental crisis. It's a lot to process. And I think it's time for a break so we can all, take a deep breath and digest all this information before we dive back into this fascinating but somewhat unsettling topic. We'll be back soon to explore what makes humanity so resilient and what steps we can take to actually build a brighter future.
Stick around, folks, because even though the challenges are significant, there's still plenty of reason for hope. We'll be back soon to delve into those glimmers of possibility. Welcome back. It really is fascinating when you think about it. We've just gone through a whole list of potential apocalypses, and yet here we are. Humans have this knack for persisting.
I know, right? It makes you wonder what it would really take to wipe us out. Like, is there some Achilles heel, some ultimate vulnerability we haven't considered? What makes some species go extinct while others manage to survive even the most catastrophic events?
That's a question that keeps a lot of scientists up at night, I bet. And to answer that, I think we have to look beyond the specific threats, and think about the bigger picture. What makes a species vulnerable to extinction in the first place?
Okay, let's get philosophical for a minute then. What are those factors? How do we measure how likely a species is to survive, especially when we're talking about these huge events that could potentially wipe out, a huge chunk of life on Earth?
Well, there are a few key things that come into play. One is specialization. Think about species that are really adapted to a specific niche, right? Like a particular food source or a very specific type of habitat. They're much more vulnerable to changes in their environment. Take the koala, for example. They basically only eat eucalyptus leaves. If something happened to eucalyptus forests, koalas would be in big trouble.
So the more adaptable a species is, the better its chances of survival. Makes sense. But humans are pretty adaptable, aren't we? We live all over the place, from deserts to the Arctic. We eat all kinds of foods, and we've developed all this technology to help us survive in all sorts of challenging conditions.
True. Humans are incredibly adaptable. We've colonized almost every corner of the planet. We've even gone into space. But that adaptability, a lot of it hinges on these complex systems, complex technologies, and those can be vulnerable to disruptions. Look at our food systems, for example. We rely on these global supply chains. If something major happened, like a pandemic or a big global conflict, those systems could break down, and then it'd be harder for us to get the things we need.
Right, so our adaptability has kind of created new dependencies that we might not have had before. But going back to those factors you mentioned, you talked about specialization. What else is there?
Another really crucial factor is population size and distribution. A species with a small population, or one that's concentrated in a small area, they're much more vulnerable to a single catastrophic event. Imagine a disease outbreak or a natural disaster that wipes out a big chunk of that population. The entire species could be at risk.
It's like putting all your eggs in one basket, right? If the basket breaks, you're in trouble. So a species that's widespread and has a larger population, they're more likely to weather the storm, because even if one population gets wiped out, others can survive.
Exactly. And this is where things get interesting for humans. We've got over 8 billion people on this planet, spread out across every continent. That gives us a certain level of resilience, right? Even if some massive disaster wiped out a big chunk of the population, it's likely that at least some groups would survive in other parts of the world.
So our sheer numbers and global reach are actually working in our favor when it comes to these extinction-level threats. It's funny because we often talk about overpopulation as a problem.
It's kind of a double-edged sword in this context. Our large population size and widespread distribution might protect us from certain things, but it also makes us more vulnerable to things like pandemics. The more densely populated we are, the more we travel and interact, the faster a disease can spread. We saw this with the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. It spread across the globe incredibly quickly, even with all our efforts to contain it.
Right. It shows just how interconnected we are and how a local problem can quickly become a global crisis. And speaking of interconnectedness, it makes me think about our reliance on technology. How does that factor into our vulnerability or resilience?
That's a really important question, and one we're still trying to figure out. Technology has definitely given us incredible powers, right? We can manipulate our environment, extend our lifespans, connect with each other in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago. But it also creates new vulnerabilities and dependencies. Take electricity, for example. If we had a massive solar flare or a major cyber attack on the power grid, the consequences could be devastating. We're talking about communication systems, transportation networks, even access to food and water being disrupted. It's not a pretty picture.
It's like we've built this incredibly sophisticated house of cards. It's impressive, but also incredibly fragile. And if you pull out one card, the whole structure could come tumbling down.
That's a great analogy. And it's not just about physical infrastructure either. Our social and economic systems are getting more complex and interconnected all the time. Imagine a global financial crisis, for example. It could trigger widespread unrest and instability, which could then make us more vulnerable to other threats like resource scarcity, conflict, or even pandemics.
So it's like our greatest strength, our ability to create and innovate, can also be a potential weakness. It's a bit of a paradox.
It is, and it makes predicting the future of humanity incredibly challenging. We're constantly pushing boundaries, but also creating new risks and uncertainties along the way. It's a delicate balancing act.
So it's not just about identifying specific threats, but also about understanding how all these complex systems interact, and how our own actions and choices can either make those risks worse or help to reduce them. It's about seeing the big picture and recognizing that our interconnectedness creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. And that brings us right back to the original question, can anything wipe us out? Honestly, the answer is we just don't know for sure. But by understanding those factors that contribute to extinction, specialization versus adaptability, population size and distribution, our reliance on complex systems, and even the unintended consequences of our own ingenuity, well, we can at least start to make better decisions about how to protect ourselves.
I see what you mean. It's not about living in fear of the apocalypse, but about understanding the risks and doing what we can to reduce them. It's about recognizing that our choices matter, and we have a responsibility to future generations to create a world where humanity can thrive, not just barely survive. All right, so we've spent a good chunk of time exploring all these existential threats, right? Asteroids, supervolcanoes, the potential dangers of our own technology. It's been, a pretty thought-provoking journey, to say the least. But now let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about solutions. What can we actually do to reduce these risks and build a more resilient future for ourselves?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the good news is there are a lot of smart people out there working on this very problem. They've come up with some really promising strategies that give me, at least, a bit of hope.
Okay, I like the sound of that. Give me some hope. What kind of strategies are we talking about here? How do you even begin to tackle something as big and complex as an existential threat?
Well, one key area is what we call planetary defense. It's basically about developing ways to detect and deflect potentially hazardous asteroids and comets. Think of it like creating a cosmic shield to protect Earth from those space rocks that could pose a threat to our existence.
A cosmic shield? That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Is that even within our reach?
It might sound like science fiction, but the technology is actually pretty advanced. We've got telescopes constantly scanning the skies for near-Earth objects, and scientists are working on different methods for deflecting an asteroid if we ever need to.
Wow, really?
Yeah. One idea is to use a spacecraft to gently nudge an asteroid off course, just slightly change its trajectory so it misses Earth. Another, more dramatic methods would be to use a nuclear explosion to break the asteroid apart.
Okay, now that's definitely sci-fi movie material. But it's reassuring to know we're not just sitting ducks waiting for an asteroid to hit us. But what about those other threats, like pandemics? They seem a lot harder to predict and control. What can we do to prepare for those?
You're right. Pandemics are tricky because they're so unpredictable. But we can do a lot to improve our preparedness and response. Strengthening public health systems is key. Investing in research and development for vaccines and treatments, and maybe most importantly, improving global cooperation and communication. We need to be able to share information quickly and effectively across borders so we can track and contain outbreaks before they become global pandemics.
So being proactive and working together, it sounds like a pretty good strategy for just about any challenge, especially when we're talking about global threats that don't respect borders or political boundaries. But what about those human-made threats, like nuclear war or the risks from advanced AI? Those seem particularly tough to deal with. How do we even begin to approach those?
When it comes to nuclear weapons, I think the most obvious solution is disarmament. There are international efforts to reduce stockpiles and prevent the spread of these incredibly destructive weapons. It's a slow process, lots of political challenges, but it's absolutely essential if we want to avoid the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear war.
Makes sense. And AI, how do you control something that could potentially be smarter than us? That feels like a challenge straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It's one of the biggest questions facing humanity today, that's for sure. Right now, researchers are working on what's called AI alignment, which is basically about ensuring that AI systems are designed and developed in a way that aligns with our values and goals.
So in other words, making sure our creations don't turn against us. That's an actual job.
It is, and it's incredibly important and incredibly daunting. And it's not just about the technical stuff either. It also involves some really deep ethical and philosophical questions. We need to think carefully about what kind of future we're creating with these powerful technologies. It's not just about what we can do, but what we should do.
It feels like we're navigating uncharted territory. We're creating technologies that could change everything, but also creating new risks that we're still trying to wrap our heads around.
That's exactly it. And then, of course, I have the environmental crisis. That's arguably the biggest challenge of them all because it's so multifaceted and interconnected with everything else.
Yeah, that's the one that always feels so overwhelming. Where do you even start? It feels so vast and complex. What can we possibly do to address something that affects literally every aspect of our lives?
There's no magic bullet, that's for sure. But there's a lot we can do, both individually and collectively. We can transition to renewable energy, reduce our consumption, protect biodiversity, invest in sustainable agriculture and forestry. It's really about changing how we live, how we interact with the planet. We need to move away from a model of exploitation and embrace a model of stewardship.
That's a pretty big shift, though. It requires us to fundamentally change our thinking, right? To be willing to make sacrifices for the long-term good for ourselves and for future generations. Do you think we're up to the challenge?
I do. I really believe we have the capacity for change, for innovation, and for compassion. We've overcome enormous challenges of the past, and I think we can overcome this one too. But it's going to take a collective effort. We have to recognize that we're all in this together.
You're right. It's easy to get bogged down in all the doom and gloom, but there's a lot of hope and ingenuity out there. There are so many people, organizations, governments around the world working towards a better future. And even small actions can make a difference.
That's the spirit. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of it all, but we're not powerless. We have choices, and those choices matter.
Well said. So I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored some pretty dark corners of the universe, from those asteroid impacts to supervolcanoes to the potential dangers of our own technology. But we've also uncovered reasons for hope, some potential solutions, and most importantly, the power of human ingenuity and our resilience.
We've seen that there are a lot of things that could potentially wipe us out, but there are also reasons to be optimistic. We have the knowledge, the technology, and I think the will to build a more resilient and sustainable future for ourselves and for future generations. The future isn't set in stone. We create it through our choices and actions.
Exactly. And the key takeaway, I think, is that we're not helpless bystanders in all of this. We have choices. And those choices have real consequences. So let's choose wisely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring these existential questions with you. And remember, even though the challenges are real and they're big, there's also a lot of potential for a brighter future. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep that hope alive. 7/16/88